Everyone mocked her for saving the saddest horse at the auction until the truth he carried broke a 20-year silence in their town. On a quiet Appalachian morning, a woman walked into a small-town livestock auction and chose the one horse everyone else had already given up on. They laughed at her until the scars on his body and the secrets buried in his dust-covered coat pulled her into a truth the whole town had tried to forget. The November air in the Appalachian Valley carried a thin, metallic chill, the kind that clung to breath and bone, settling over the small livestock auction yard like a tired old blanket. People gathered in loose clusters, boots scraping against frozen dirt, their voices drifting under the pale morning sun. Most of them looked as though they'd seen more winters than they cared to count, shoulders angled inward, huddling in the cold. Evelyn Hart stood apart from them, hands tucked into the pockets of her worn canvas coat. Her dark hair, usually tied back neatly, had escaped in strands that fluttered beside her face. She wasn't here for anything in particular. At least that's what she had told herself. She claimed she wanted some spare lumber someone mentioned might be sold. But she had driven the 7 miles from her cabin with a heaviness in her chest, a curiosity she couldn't name, like something unseen had quietly tugged her here. The auctioneer's voice droned through a crackling loudspeaker. Cattle, goats, a mule that kicked the fence hard enough to draw laughter. But the crowd shifted uneasily when the next animal stumbled into the ring. A horse, if one could still call it that without feeling dishonest. He was painfully thin, his reddish-brown coat dull and patchy, ribs showing like the curved teeth of a broken comb. His head hung low, as though even lifting it required negotiation. A long, healed-over scar ran diagonally across his shoulder, catching the winter light. His mane looked tangled with a season's worth of neglect. Someone near the front snorted, "Lord, that's the saddest creature I've ever seen. Who'd waste $1 on that?" Another chuckled. "Should have just let him wander back into the woods. Nature would have finished him quicker." Their laughter spread like frost, quick, sharp, unkind. But Evelyn heard none of it. Her eyes had locked onto the horses, which were dark and glossy, not lifeless, not empty, but tired in a way she recognized intimately. The kind of tired that came from holding on long after the world had let go. "He's labeled Lot 34, the auctioneer sighed, barely masking frustration. "Salvage only. Starting bid, $5. No one raised a hand. The horse shifted, wincing as if the earth itself pained him. His breath puffed out in slow clouds, but his gaze, steady, unwavering, lifted toward Evelyn. It held her completely, like a hand around her heartbeat. Something in her chest tightened. She hadn't expected that. It had. Been years since anything stirred her that quickly. Years since anything pierced through the quiet numbness she had built like a shelter. She thought of the long nights alone in her woodshop, carving mountain birds out of driftwood while the radio murmured old country songs. She thought of a time before silence had become her constant companion. And then she felt her hand rising, almost against her own understanding. "I'll take him," she said, her voice steady but soft. The auctioneer blinked. "We have $5. Do we hear 10? No response. A rustle of confusion rippled through the crowd. One man chuckled, elbowing his friend. Crazy Heart finally lost it. Figures she'd pick the one animal that's halfway to the grave. Evelyn ignored them, walking toward the pen as the gavel came down. Sold! Her boots crunched over the frosted ground, while a few onlookers kept whispering, shaking their heads. Doesn't she live alone up on that ridge? What's she want with a half-dead horse? Maybe she's trying to save it, though it won't matter. But when Evelyn approached the gate, the horse lifted his head a little higher, as if gathering the last of his remaining strength. She unlatched the gate slowly, letting the metal click softly, instead of clanging. He didn't shy away. Instead, he exhaled a shaky breath, fogging the air between them. and stepped closer. "You're coming home with me," she murmured. The horse blinked once, a slow, tired movement that looked almost like trust. She placed her palm against his neck. Beneath the rough coat she felt warmth, a flicker of life refusing to be extinguished. For the first time in months, something inside her warmed too. The murmurs behind her faded as she led him toward her trailer, step by step, letting him take all the time he needed. His hooves dragged slightly, but he followed, quiet and obedient, as though he understood that she wasn't here to judge or rush him. She didn't have a name for him yet, but she felt certain that one would come, and though she couldn't explain why, Evelyn sensed that this frail creature, mocked, discarded, nearly forgotten, had not stumbled into her life by coincidence. Not today. Not him. Something waited ahead of them, tucked between memory and shadow. Something only a horse like this could have carried. The road back to Evelyn's cabin curled along the ridge like an old ribbon, half buried under layers of fallen leaves and early winter frost. She drove slowly, mindful of the horse trailer bumping gently behind her truck. The animal inside barely shifted. Even through the metal walls she could sense his exhaustion, a quiet resignation she knew too well. By the time she reached her clearing, the afternoon sun had softened into a warm amber glow, the kind that stretched long shadows between the trees and made the mountains seem farther away than they were. Her cabin stood in the middle of a small meadow, surrounded by maples and hickories that trembled in the wind. She slid the truck into park and stepped out, drawing in the crisp air. For the first time all day, she allowed herself a breath that didn't feel borrowed. When she opened the trailer door, the horse blinked slowly at the shifting light. He hesitated before lowering his head and stepping onto the ground, hooves tapping faintly against the frozen dirt. Evelyn kept her hand on the rope, but he didn't need much guidance. He followed willingly toward the old lean-to shelter beside her woodshop. Inside, the quiet settled thick as blanket. No crowd, no laughter, no cold stares from the auction yard. Only the faint rustle of hay and the steady hum of the mountains in the distance. Evelyn brushed off some of the loose straw and guided him to the clean corner she had hastily prepared that morning, as though something in her bones had predicted this. She reached for a blanket and laid it over his back. He shivered at her touch, but not from fear. He simply wasn't used to comfort. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice a soft murmur blending with the rustling trees. "You're safe here." The horse's breathing steadied. When she finally fetched a bucket of warm water, he drank with slow, deliberate gulps, like each swallow negotiated with fatigue. Once he finished, Evelyn set the bucket aside and picked up a worn curry comb. The first stroke down his shoulder revealed more than dirt. Beneath the ragged coat was a long, pale scar that cut across his skin like a lightning bolt. She paused, tracing its outline with her thumb. Old, years old by the look of it, yet formed in a way that didn't match what she knew about pasture injuries. "Where did you get this?" she murmured, though she wasn't expecting an answer. She continued working down his side, carefully teasing out tangles and debris. Each pass revealed more markings, small healed abrasions, a deeper indentation near his flank, and tiny flecks of something dark trapped in the hairs close to his chest. She leaned in and pressed gently. A faint dusting of black particles clung to her fingers. She rubbed them together. They smeared easily, leaving a faint charcoal streak across her skin. For a moment her breath caught, not because of what it was, but because of what it reminded her of. The color, the texture. It was almost indistinguishable from coal dust. And not just any coal dust, a particular kind she hadn't seen since before the world broke open beneath her feet 20 years ago, before the mine collapse, before the search ended, before the quiet began. Her fingers trembled. She brushed aside the horse's coat again, finding more dark specks, nestled deeper, as though he'd lain somewhere thick with it. She felt the ground shift beneath years of grief she'd carefully buried. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That mine was sealed. It has been sealed since—" She cut off her own words. The horse huffed gently, turning his head toward her. His eyes weren't pleading. They weren't frightened. They were patient, almost expectant, as though he needed her to understand something he couldn't show any other way. Evelyn swallowed hard and set the comb aside. She grabbed a clean cloth, dipped it in warm water, and scrubbed gently at the darkened fur. More of the black dust lifted to the cloth, staining it in uneven streaks. A shiver ran through her, colder than the mountain air. There should be no coal dust left in these hills, not from that mine, not after everything that happened. The officials had insisted every shaft had been sealed, every entrance collapsed and reinforced. They said the accident was unavoidable, a natural shift in the rock. They said no negligence had occurred. They said the search had gone as far as it could. They said a lot of things. The cloth slipped from her hand. Her knees felt unsteady. She moved to sit on a nearby crate, pressing a hand to her mouth as memories pressed close, sirens echoing off the mountain, neighbors' faces pale and wordless, the harsh glare of floodlights, and the moment an official laid a hand on her shoulder, telling her they couldn't safely continue. Yet here, 2 decades later, a broken horse had arrived trailing the same dust she once scrubbed from her son's boots. She felt her heartbeat thud in her throat. The sky outside dimmed, softening into the lavender hue of early dusk. The horse shifted, stepping closer until she felt his warmth beside her knee. Without thinking, she reached up and placed her hand against his cheek. His skin warmed beneath her palm, grounding her, not dragging her backward, but anchoring her firmly in this moment. "You've been somewhere you shouldn't have been," she whispered, "somewhere they swore no one could go." He blinked slowly, the faintest exhale stirring a strand of her hair. Evelyn glanced toward the tree line beyond her cabin, toward the mountains that had kept her secrets as faithfully as they kept their own. A question rose in her, trembling yet undeniable. What if the past wasn't as buried as they told her? And what if this horse was the first sign? A wind brushed through the branches, scattering dry leaves like restless whispers. Evelyn drew a long breath, steadying herself. She didn't know why Ashfall had come to her. She didn't know what story his scars carried, or why the dust clinging to his coat felt like a message rising from the earth itself. But she knew one thing with startling clarity. This wasn't an accident. He hadn't simply been the saddest horse. He was a beginning, and the mountains were not done speaking. Morning crept quietly across the ridge, pale and unhurried, filtering through the frost-laced windows of Evelyn's cabin. She had barely slept. Her mind had circled the same questions again and again, each one darker than the last, yet all bound to the same impossible truth. Ashfall had carried coal dust on his coat. Not ordinary coal dust, that coal dust. The kind that belonged to a place sealed by government order, a place that had become a wound she never touched. When she stepped outside, the cold bit at her cheeks. A thin ribbon of mist rose from the earth, drifting between the hickories and the maples as if the mountain were waking with a sigh. Ashfall stood near the fence, his posture straighter than yesterday, though he still carried weariness in every muscle. He lifted his head as she approached, ears flicking forward with a quiet familiarity that surprised her. "You're looking better," she murmured, offering him a handful of hay. He accepted it gently, the warmth of his breath brushing her palm. The simple contact steadied her, just enough for her to face the truth she'd been pushing aside since last night. The black dust hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been residue from the auction yard or the trailer. She'd checked, twice. As she brushed through his coat again, careful and unhurried, she uncovered more of the faint charcoal particles. Some were caught behind his foreleg, others near the ridge of his spine. The deeper she combed, the more her unease grew. Coal dust didn't cling like that unless an animal had rolled in it or rested on ground thick with it. Ground from a mine that should have been inaccessible. A distant hawk cried overhead, its sharp notes slicing through the morning stillness. Evelyn paused, eyes drifting toward the distant slope where the old mining roads once cut through the trees. The forest had grown back since then, weaving itself into a tapestry of shadows and memories. But she could still trace the old path if she tried. Every curve, every incline, every place search teams had gathered before they walked into the earth and later came out with empty hands. Ashfall shifted his weight, tugging gently at the brush still resting against his side, as if nudging her from the past back into the present. "All right," she sighed, "let's at least try to figure out where you've been." She walked around him, inspecting the dirt clinging to his hooves, mud mixed with darker granules caked in the grooves. She crouched, lifting one hoof carefully to examine it. The pattern was unmistakable, damp clay streaked with coal residue. A combination she hadn't seen since her son's boots came home from long shifts underground, before everything fell apart. Her breath trembled. Someone must have taken Ashfall near the mines recently. But why? The more she thought about it, the less sense it made. The mine had been condemned, fenced off, posted with bright warning signs, and yet the dust on this horse was fresh enough to stain her fingers. The air chilled further as the sun dipped behind a cloud, but another realization warmed her with a strange, uneasy clarity. Maybe Ashfall hadn't simply wandered from a pasture. Maybe he'd escaped something. She stood, brushing off her hands, and walked toward her woodshop. Inside, the scent of cedar and sawdust was familiar, comforting. Her half-finished carvings rested where she'd left them. Songbirds, foxes, a mountain lion poised mid-leap. Her tools lay neatly arranged beside a radio that had been silent for weeks. But today the shop felt different, smaller, as though her world had shifted overnight, and this place, once her refuge, could no longer contain her questions. She dug through a stack of old storage boxes until she found a folded map of the region. It was faded, corners curled from age, but it still showed the web of mining tunnels beneath the ridge. Some of the tunnels hadn't been used since the 70s, and most were collapsed or filled. The one that mattered, the number 9 shaft, had been the deepest, the most dangerous, and the one that had swallowed the search teams after the disaster. Her finger traced the incline that led toward it. A forgotten road. A hidden bend. Places workers once stood smoking before dawn. The map quivered slightly in her hands. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was anticipation. A pull. Ashfall snorted from outside, stamping a hoof lightly, as though calling her back. She returned to him, the map still in hand. The horse watched her with the same steady patience he'd shown since the auction, an ancient kind of knowing, as if he recognized something in her struggle. "Did you go up there?" she whispered, pointing toward the ridge. "Is that where you came from?" He didn't look away. Not once. The wind picked up, sweeping across the hillside and stirring the fallen leaves into a restless dance. It brushed through Ashfall's mane, lifting it just enough for sunlight to slide across the faint patterns beneath his coat, patterns she hadn't noticed before. Not scars. Not exactly. More like indentations shaped by pressure, as though something heavy had pressed against him for a long time. A fence? A collapsed beam? Her pulse quickened. Suddenly she felt a presence behind her. A human one. Startled, she turned to see Mariah Dalton, the young woman who worked weekends at the local feed store, standing near the gate, her cheeks red from the hike up the ridge. "Oh, sorry," Mariah said quickly. "Didn't mean to scare you. Virgil said you bought a horse yesterday. I was driving by and thought I'd check in." Her eyes widened when she spotted Ashfall. "Lord, he looks like he's been through some things." "He has," Evelyn replied softly. Maria stepped closer, studying the horse with gentle curiosity. "You know, I help out at the Dalton stables sometimes. Haven't seen markings like that before. He must have lived somewhere rough." "Or been taken somewhere rough," Evelyn murmured. Maria frowned. "What do you mean?" Evelyn considered telling her about the dust, the scars, the way the mountains seemed to whisper secrets through the horse's presence, but something held her back, not distrust, just caution. This was bigger than a simple injury pattern, bigger than anything Evelyn had confronted since the mine closed. "I'm not sure yet," she said finally, "but I'll find out." Maria nodded, sensing boundaries. "If you need anything, feed, medicine, help loading him, just let me know. Seriously." "Thank you," Evelyn said, meaning it. After Maria left, Evelyn lingered beside the horse for a long time, fingertips lightly brushing his mane. The sun had shifted again, warming the clearing with a golden hue that made the dust particles floating in the air shimmer like drifting embers. "You didn't come here to be rescued," she whispered. "You came to show me something." Ashfall lowered his head until his muzzle touched her shoulder, a gesture so deliberate, so gentle, that her breath caught in her throat. The mountains stood silent around them. But Evelyn felt it. A pull, a direction toward the ridge, toward the past, toward the truth, and for the first time in 20 years she wasn't afraid to follow. The sky deepened into a muted silver by the time Evelyn finished her morning chores, the kind of light that softened everything it touched. Ashfall stood near the fence line, quietly watching her as she folded the map along its creases. It had been years since she'd studied the twists and turns of the old mining roads, and now the paper felt heavier than memory alone. A part of her wished she could unsee the coal dust clinging to the horse's coat. Another part, stronger, steadier, felt as though the mountain itself had finally exhaled, guiding her toward what she had refused to face. She slipped the map into her jacket pocket and opened the gate. Ashfall stepped forward without hesitation, lowering his head as if acknowledging her silent question. Something about him made the air feel charged, as though the very ground beneath them carried faint currents of old stories waiting to be told. "All right," she whispered, resting her hand on his neck. "Let's walk." The forest welcomed them with a hush, the fallen leaves muffling their steps. The path had once been clear and well-traveled. Men in soot-covered boots had marched this way each morning, lanterns swinging in the pre-dawn dark. Now, after decades without footsteps to hold it open, the road had narrowed into a ribbon swallowed by roots and undergrowth. Branches arched overhead like interwoven ribs, filtering sunlight into shifting, dappled patterns across the ground. Ashfall walked beside her instead of trailing behind, a slow and steady rhythm that soothed her nerves. He paused occasionally, angling his head as if listening for something Evelyn could not hear. She trusted his instincts more than her own sense of direction. Somehow he knew exactly where to turn long before the old mining markers appeared. Half a mile in, she noticed the first relic, a splintered wooden post half submerged in the soil, paint flaking from its surface. Beyond it lay a rusted coil of abandoned cable, coiled like a snake long since gone cold. The forest had nearly consumed these artifacts, weaving moss over steel and lifting saplings where tools once fell. Yet confronting them now awakened something in Evelyn, a sensation like brushing fingers along a scar you'd forgotten was there. Ashfall tugged lightly on the rope, urging her off the path toward a slope where the trees grew denser. Evelyn hesitated. She had never ventured this far after the collapse. The rescue teams had been ordered away before they could explore every side of the ridge, and she remembered the helpless frustration that had burned in her chest when officials declared the site too unstable to continue. Ashfall nudged her shoulder again. "You want me to follow, don't you?" she murmured. He didn't break eye contact. The air cooled noticeably as they climbed, the forest tightening around them. Every now and then a gust of wind carried the faint scent of earth and minerals, raw, metallic, familiar. It reminded her of the nights she'd scrubbed coal dust from her son's jeans, the way it clung to fabric like a shadow that wouldn't wash out. A shiver ran through her, but she kept walking. At the top of the rise, the trees opened into a clearing she didn't recognize. Not large, but oddly symmetrical, as though humans had shaped it long ago. Ashfall stopped at its center and pawed at the ground. Beneath the thin layer of leaves lay an old plank of wood, brittle but intact enough to show the faint outline of numbers once carved into its surface. Evelyn knelt, brushing away debris. The carving was almost gone, but she could still distinguish a faint 9 beside a diagonal slash. Her breath faltered. "No," she whispered, eyes stinging. The number 9 path wasn't supposed to reach this far. Ashfall lowered his head until it nearly touched the plank, breathing in long, steady pulls, as though confirming something she could not yet grasp. The wind picked up suddenly, rushing through the clearing with enough force to rattle the branches overhead. When it finally softened, Evelyn noticed a faint trail leading away from the plank, subtle but unmistakably shaped by hoof prints. Fresh ones. Ashfall's prints weren't the only marks. Another horse had passed through not long ago. The sight sent a pulse through her chest. Someone else had been here recently. Someone with access to a mine that government documents insisted had been sealed for decades. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she followed the faint trail deeper into the trees. Each step carried a new mixture of dread and determination. The truth she had avoided for 20 years was no longer buried. Ashfall had unearthed it simply by existing. The forest thickened again, branches scraping gently against her jacket. The air cooled sharply. And then the trees parted, revealing a narrow ravine chiseled into the hillside, its walls draped, with vines that looked like they had been pushed aside many times. At the ravine's base, part hidden beneath fallen stones, was a wooden frame reinforced with rusted bolts, a doorway large enough for a miner to enter. Evelyn froze. Her pulse roared in her ears. The number 9 access point. Not sealed, not destroyed, not gone. The truth was here, breathing through the cracks of the mountain. Ashfall stepped beside her and exhaled softly, as though urging her to look closer. His warm breath brushed her sleeve, grounding her in the moment, keeping her from slipping into the vortex of memory threatening to swallow her whole. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I'm not ready," she whispered, but even as the words trembled in the cold air, she knew she didn't have the luxury of waiting anymore. Something had led Ashfall to her. Something had brought this horse from the shadows of a closed mine to the hands of a woman who had spent 20 years running from the same darkness. And now the mountains had opened their mouth again, showing her an entrance she wasn't meant to see, but needed to. She placed her hand against the weathered wooden frame. It pulsed cold beneath her palm. Behind her, Ashfall shifted, watching her with an intensity that felt like a promise. "All right," she breathed. "We go forward." The wind whispered through the clearing once more, and somewhere deep within the ridge a hollow echo answered, low, quiet. Ancient, like the mountain remembering a story it had held too long. Evelyn glanced back at the path they'd taken, but it was gone, swallowed by trees. There was no turning back now. The doorway to the ravine felt like the mouth of an old beast, silent, patient, and far from harmless. Evelyn stood before it with one hand braced against the weathered frame, aware of every breath she took. The forest behind her had fallen still, as if even the wind refused to intrude. Ashfall remained close, his presence a steady warmth at her side, a reminder that she was no longer walking this path alone. She leaned forward, letting her eyes adjust to the dim space carved into the earth. The first few feet were choked with tangled vines and fallen stones, but beyond that, a narrow corridor extended into darkness. Not collapsed, not sealed, simply forgotten, or worse, deliberately concealed. The truth pressed against her ribs, a pressure she'd carried for 20 years without words. "Who opened this?" she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Ashfall pawed gently at the ground as if echoing the question. Evelyn cleared away enough debris to slip through the doorway. The air on the other side felt colder, tinged with the faint metallic smell she remembered from the long nights she waited outside the rescue tents, days when miners came out covered in soot and she had prayed to see her son among them. Her fingers trembled as she flicked her flashlight on, the beam cutting a narrow path through the settling dust. The shin. Walls were reinforced with timber beams, many of them splintered or bowed. Age had twisted them into strange, crooked shapes. Yet scattered along the interior were footprints, in the soft earth and along patches of old clay, some larger, human, others unmistakably shaped like hooves, fresh enough that they hadn't been washed away by time or weather. Her pulse quickened. Ashfall wasn't the only one who had passed through here recently. She stepped deeper, sweeping the light across the walls. Faded chalk markings still lingered near the ceiling. Numbers, initials, arrows scratched out by miners long gone. Further in, she spotted a cracked lantern resting on the floor. When she picked it up, more coal dust drifted off in a small cloud. It coated her gloves like a memory she couldn't shake. "Someone's been using this," she murmured. "Recently." A hollow drip echoed from somewhere deeper in the shaft. The sound startled her, not loud, but haunting in the enveloping silence. She moved forward slowly, careful not to disturb the loose rocks scattered underfoot. Ashfall remained outside, shifting restlessly, as though he sensed the mine's hunger and was unwilling to let her disappear into it. She reached the first chamber, once a junction point where carts had changed direction. Now the tracks lay under broken stones, and the air tasted heavier. Her flashlight beam caught something metallic half buried beneath rubble. She crouched, brushing dirt aside, a brass tag, oval, scratched. When she turned it over, her heart faltered. No. 14, heart. Her son's shift tag. Her throat tightened as she clutched it, the cold metal biting into her palm. She remembered pinning that tag to his jacket the day he started working the mines. 16. Too young but proud. He wanted to help. He wanted to prove himself. She had hugged him that morning without knowing it would be the last time she held him whole. Her legs trembled. She sat back against the stone wall, sliding down until she was half kneeling. 20 years of grief pressed against her chest, constricting, rising in waves. She thought she had accepted the official reports. Collapse, no survivors beyond the first rescue window, unsafe conditions preventing further search. She had forced herself to swallow those answers because there were no others. But here, in her hand, lay proof the story wasn't as clean or final as she'd been told. She pressed the tag against her forehead, eyes squeezed shut. My boy, you were here. You were really here. A sound stirred behind her, a quiet exhale. She turned to see Ashfall standing just outside the chamber's entrance, watching her. His gaze held a strange softness, almost protective, as if he understood exactly what she was holding. She reached toward him, her fingers brushing the air between them. His breath warmed her chilled skin. "Thank you for bringing me," she whispered. The mine shifted faintly, just a settling groan from old beams. But it jerked Evelyn back to her feet. She pocketed the tag carefully and forced herself to keep exploring. She had to understand why ashfall had come from here, why this place, declared unsafe, sealed off, had seen life again. Further down the corridor, the earth floor gave way to hard-packed clay mixed with deep furrows. She knelt to examine them. They weren't caused by tools or machinery. They were made by hooves, more than one set, and human boots. Someone had been using this path repeatedly. A low murmuring hum echoed through the deeper shaft. Not machinery, not wind. Something subtler, a vibration she felt more than heard. She shone her light ahead and saw the faint outline of a wooden brace collapsed inward, the boards shattered. Beyond it, a narrow gap led into another chamber. She squeezed through cautiously, inhaling dust that tasted like stone and memory. Her flashlight illuminated an unexpected sight, a makeshift enclosure constructed from old beams and scrap metal sheets. The enclosure door hung crookedly, one hinge broken. Inside, scattered hay still clung to the ground. Someone kept a horse here. Her breath caught. Ashfall whinnied softly behind her, and she turned the light toward him. His ears flicked back, a tremor running along his flank. He recognized this place, not as a home, but as a prison. Evelyn approached the wall where faint markings marred the wood, deep scratches made by hooves, signs of panic, signs of pain. She swallowed, her chest tightening. What had happened here? Why had anyone kept a horse inside a sealed mine? And how had ashfall escaped? She backed away, her thoughts a tangled storm. The enclosure was too small, too crude to be anything but a holding pen. Temporary. Hidden. Someone had intended to bring an animal here, leave it unseen, unrecorded. The idea churned uneasily inside her. Ashfall nudged her shoulder again, tilting his head toward the way out. He wanted her to leave, to breathe air that wasn't thick with the weight of old sorrow. She stepped back into the main shaft, grateful for the forest light waiting outside. As she emerged, the sunlight felt unfamiliar, too bright after the mine's shadowed truths. She leaned against ashfall, drawing calm from the steady cadence of his breathing. "This wasn't an accident," she murmured. "Not any of it." Her voice trembled, but her resolve did not. She reached into her pocket, gripping the shift tag tightly. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening. "If someone reopened the number 9 shaft," she whispered, "I need to know who and why." Ashfall snorted softly, his breath rising like a question into the cold air. Evelyn lifted her gaze toward the distant silhouette of the town below. The same town that once mourned with her, then moved on. There were still people who knew more than they said, still secrets buried in the hills. She straightened, brushing dust from her jacket. "Come on, ashfall. We're not done." Together they turned back toward the path, leaving the mine behind, but carrying its truths like embers glowing beneath ash. The sun dipped low as Evelyn and Ashfall made their way down the ridge, the sky shifting into that deep Appalachian blue that always appeared just before nightfall. The forest behind them seemed to hold its breath, as if unwilling to release the secrets she had uncovered. With every step, the weight of the shift tag in her pocket grew heavier, its edges pressing into her thigh like a quiet reminder that the past was no longer content to sleep. By the time she reached the gravel road leading back into town, the cabin lights scattered across the valley flickered to life one by one. She didn't want to speak to anyone. She wanted time, space, to untangle her thoughts. But the image of the rusted enclosure inside the shaft, the hoof scratches carved into rotting beams, and the unmistakable presence of human footprints would not allow her silence. There was only one person in this town who had the authority to shut down the mine 20 years ago. and only one person she knew who had walked those tunnels as easily as others walked Main Street: Samuel Riggs. She led Ashfall into the small paddock beside her cabin and made sure he had fresh water. He nickered softly when she lingered with her hand pressed to his cheek, as though sensing her hesitation. The truth she had found today was sharp-edged. It cut differently than the slow ache of grief. It demanded action. "I'll be back soon," she whispered. Leaving Ashfall in the soft glow of the porch light, Evelyn slid into her truck and drove toward the town, her headlights carving a narrow orange trail through the growing dusk. The tires crunched over gravel, the engine humming, a thin comfort in a night thick with uncertainty. Samuel lived in a small blue house near the general store, a place cluttered with old mining equipment and tools he never seemed to part with. When she pulled into his driveway, she saw his truck outside, lights off, curtains drawn. She hesitated only a second before ascending the porch steps. Her knock echoed in the quiet. A shuffle sounded inside. After a moment, the door cracked open, revealing Samuel's lined face, framed by the yellow glow of a single lamp. He wore a flannel shirt and heavy work pants, as if he'd just come in from splitting wood. His expression shifted when he saw her. Surprise, quickly eclipsed by something like dread. "Evening, Evelyn," he said, voice gravelly. "Didn't expect company." "I need to talk to you," she replied, forcing steadiness into her tone. "It's important." He hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in." The interior smelled faintly of pine resin and old paper. A space heater rattled in the corner, struggling against the creeping chill. Samuel motioned toward a chair, but Evelyn remained standing. Her fingers brushed the outline of the tag in her pocket. She needed him to answer questions she had avoided for 2 decades. "I went up the ridge today," she began quietly. "Past the old transport road, past where they fenced the slopes after the collapse." Samuel's jaw locked. His hands tightened around the rag he'd been holding, knuckles whitening. "Evelyn," he warned softly, "that ground isn't safe. You shouldn't be up there." "I know exactly how unsafe it is," she said, "but I found something, a part of the number 9 shaft that wasn't sealed." His eyes snapped to hers, panic flickering beneath their surface. Panic and guilt. She continued before he could speak. "I found footprints. Human ones. Hoofprints too, and something else." Slowly she reached into her jacket and placed the shift tag on the table between them. Samuel froze. For a moment the only sound was the rattle of the space heater and the faint hum of passing trucks on the highway. His weathered hand reached out, hovering above the brass tag as though it radiated heat. "I haven't seen one of these since—" His voice broke. He didn't finish the sentence. His gaze lifted, heavy with something she had never seen on his face before. Not pity, but recognition. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew there was more to the collapse than what the officials told the families." Samuel lowered himself into the chair, shoulders sinking under an invisible weight. The rag in his hand fell to the floor. He looked old, older than his 60-something years, older than the hills themselves. "Yes," he finally said. The word trembled like a brittle twig cracking. "I knew there was more." Evelyn swallowed hard, fighting the rising heat behind her eyes. "Then why didn't you tell us?" Samuel rubbed both hands over his face. "Because they wouldn't let me. The inspectors, the company men, they were already there when the dust settled. They knew the shaft was unstable. They knew the structural beams were weakened before the collapse, but they wouldn't write it in the reports. And when the second rescue team went in and found conditions worse than expected, they ordered everyone out." "You could have said something," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking around the edges. "You could have told me the truth." His hands dropped, revealing eyes rimmed with red. "They threatened to shut down the entire mining operation if any of us spoke about it. Said hundreds of families would lose their jobs. said the town would die. And they weren't wrong, Evelyn. He looked down at the tag again. We were scared. Scared of what would happen if the truth came out. Scared of what we'd done. What you'd done? Her voice sharpened. Are you telling me the collapse wasn't an accident? Samuel's silence was louder than any confession. She stepped back as if struck. Her heart pounded, each beat a heavy echo of everything she had lost. You let them stop the search, she said. You let them tell us our boys were unreachable. His chin quivered. We thought we were protecting the town. We told ourselves it was already too late. And I didn't fight them. I should have fought. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in like the mine had closed in on her son. Evelyn gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. Each breath tasted thick, metallic, like the dust she'd inhaled earlier. Why now? She asked, voice barely steady. Why did you let me find out like this? Samuel shook his head slowly. I didn't want you anywhere near that ridge again. Someone reopened that shaft. Someone who isn't supposed to be there. And if you found it, his gaze lifted, shadows deepening beneath his eyes. It means they're still using it. The words lodged in her throat. Using it for what? Samuel closed his eyes. I don't know, but I think Ashfall knows something about whoever's been going in and out of that place. And if he led you there, you're already involved. Evelyn stared at him, anger and sorrow tangling inside her chest. She had wanted answers, clarity, but what she found instead was a decades-old fracture running straight through the heart of the town. I deserve the truth, she said finally, voice low but resolute. Samuel nodded, defeated. Yes, and it's time you heard it. All of it. He motioned toward the lantern beside his chair, the same kind miners once carried underground. Its faint glow flickered across the worn lines of his face. The night of the collapse, he began. We weren't told everything. His voice trembled into the room, the darkness gathering around them like a story, ready to break open. Samuel's voice faltered, as though the words had to push through layers of dust and memory before reaching daylight. He leaned back in his chair, shoulders slumping beneath the weight he'd carried for 2 decades. Outside, the wind pressed against the house, whispering along the eaves as though impatient for the truth to be spoken aloud at last. Evelyn stood motionless, her hand resting lightly on the table beside the brass shift tag. The lamp between them cast soft amber light across Samuel's lined face, illuminating the tension carved into every crease of his expression. She knew this moment, whatever he was about to confess, would change everything. The mine, the past, her understanding of her son's final hours. And Ashfall's mysterious presence now threaded through it all, like a guide leading her back to secrets she had never truly let go of. Samuel took a slow breath. The night of the collapse, it wasn't just the earth giving way. His voice rasped, barely audible. There were signs, clear signs. The beams had weakened weeks before. My crew reported them. I reported them. And the company sent someone down to inspect. He shook his head bitterly. Their report said everything was stable, that we were imagining things. They didn't want to halt production. Too costly, too much risk to their investors. Evelyn felt heat rising in her cheeks. So they ignored the warnings, and her throat tightened, and the miners paid for it. Samuel nodded, eyes avoiding hers. When the first tremor hit, we thought it was routine. But the second one, it came from deeper inside. A section no one had been assigned to, a place we hadn't logged activity in for months. Why would anyone be down there? Evelyn asked, voice tightening. That's the worst part, Samuel whispered. I don't think it was any of our men. Silence pooled in the room, cold and heavy. Then he continued, Some of the miners, your boy included, they were nearest to the lower tunnel when the collapse began. They were probably trying to get others out. The rescue teams reached the first chamber, but beyond that, his words trailed off. Yes, Evelyn said quietly. They said it was too dangerous. Samuel's eyes flickered with guilt. We weren't told everything. The inspectors returned before the second search. They halted operations, brought in private security, told us structural monitoring suggested another imminent collapse. They forced us off the mountain, ordered us not to speak a word. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her ears. That doesn't explain why the number 9 shaft isn't sealed. Someone was there. Recently. Samuel groaned softly, rubbing his temples. Those men, those inspectors, they weren't from the county. They weren't from the state. They were from the Energy Corporation buying up land rights across Appalachia at the time. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. And some people said they were using the older tunnels to test new equipment. Something experimental. Off the books. Evelyn stepped back, the floor seeming to shift beneath her. That makes no sense. Why use condemned tunnels? Because no one was supposed to know. Samuel's gaze hardened. If something went wrong, they could blame it on the mine's age, on the mountain, on anything but themselves. A cold tremor ran through Evelyn. Are you saying the collapse wasn't caused by a natural shift at all? Samuel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth was already breaking open between them. She swallowed the rising ache in her throat. Then my son, he might not have been where they said he was when it happened? Samuel's voice cracked. Evelyn, I honestly don't know. But when we were forced out of the shaft, I felt deep down that we weren't being told everything. And for years, I've wondered if the men working those experimental operations were the reason everything fell apart. She pressed a hand to her chest, steadying the storm of emotions. You stayed silent because you thought you were protecting the town. Protecting what we had left, he said softly. People were barely holding on. The economy was crumbling. Jobs were disappearing. If the truth came out, the mine would have been shut down even sooner. Hundreds would have lost their livelihoods. Families would have left. He looked up at her, pleading. I was scared, and I was ashamed. And now, she whispered, now I'm tired of carrying this alone. His shoulders sagged, and when you found the tag, when you found that shaft still open, it means someone else has a reason to keep using it. Someone who never wanted the truth to surface. Evelyn's breath trembled as she paced to the window. Ashfall had sensed the shaft before she had. He had led her there. He had borne scars from inside those tunnels. And now she understood why the dust clinging to his coat felt like an echo of the past, because the past wasn't gone. It was alive, pulsing beneath the mountain, shaping the present in ways she never imagined. She turned back to Samuel. I need to know who reopened it. You're walking into dangerous territory, he warned. If this is tied to that old corporation, or whatever's left of it, people could get hurt. Evelyn straightened, the faint trembling in her hands disappearing. They already hurt people. They hurt my son, and they left us to mourn without truth. Her voice steadied into something fierce. I won't live in the dark anymore. Samuel exhaled shakily. Then you'll need help. You can't do this on your own. I won't be alone, she said softly. I have Ashfall. A faint, bittersweet smile curved Samuel's mouth. Funny thing about horses, he murmured. They know where the truth lies, even when humans try to bury it. He reached into a drawer and pulled out an old ledger, dusty, bound with cracked leather. He set it gently on the table. These are the logs from the final month before the collapse. They weren't included in the official files. His voice dropped. I kept them. Couldn't bring myself to destroy them. Evelyn touched the ledger's spine. It felt like touching a doorway, one not built of wood or stone, but of memory and long-silenced warnings. "You'll find names in there," Samuel continued. "Visitors we weren't supposed to record. Deliveries that didn't match inventory sheets. Maybe somewhere in those pages you'll find what you're looking for." She tucked the ledger under her arm. "Thank you." Samuel nodded, though his eyes held deep worry. "Be careful, Evelyn. Whatever's happening now, it isn't history. It's happening in real time." As she stepped outside, the cold night air hit her lungs like a jolt. The stars glimmered faintly above the ridge, and far off in the distance, she thought she heard a low rumble rolling through the mountains. Not thunder, not wind, something else. Ashfall awaited her quietly when she returned home, lifting his head as she approached. She stroked his muzzle, feeling strength in the soft rise of breath. "Samuel told me everything," she whispered to him, "but I think you already knew." The horse blinked slowly, and in that moment she felt the strange certainty that he was not just a survivor of some hidden cruelty, but a witness. And together they were standing at the threshold of a truth the mountain had tried to bury for 20 years. Now it was ready to rise. The night pressed close around Evelyn's cabin, thick with the kind of quiet that made even the trees seem to hold still. After leaving Samuel's house, she had returned home to find Ashfall pacing near the paddock fence, restless in a way she hadn't seen before, ears flicking at every rustle, muscles twitching under his reddish coat. As she approached, he paused, the air between them charged with something unspoken, something urgent. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled faintly, while the old ledger Samuel had given her lay open on the table. Its pages were yellowed, corners curled like autumn leaves. Handwritten entries filled each line. Dates, supply tallies, shift rotations, strange delivery logs marked only with initials. But what caught her breath were the notations she'd never seen in official reports. Unnamed inspectors entering the mine after long shifts ended, unscheduled operations in the lower chambers, and vague references to subterranean mapping, a term she had never encountered in any mining report during her years living here. She traced her fingertips over a particularly unsettling line. Unauthorized equipment transferred to 9A sector. Personnel unknown. 9A. A part of the shaft she had stumbled into only yesterday. Her stomach tightened. The pieces, scattered as they were beginning to form a shape. Something deliberate. Something secret. Something that made her son's death feel far less like a tragic accident, and far more like the consequence of choices made far above the heads of the men who worked the tunnels. But the ledger revealed only hints, whispers in ink. She needed confirmation. She needed more than a dying horse's scars and Samuel's shaken confession. Yet every new revelation felt like another stone turned, another breath of truth rising from the earth. A knock sounded at her door. Evelyn jumped, heart thudding. The hour was late, too late for visitors. She wiped her hands on her jeans and moved silently across the floor. When she peered out through the small window, she saw Mariah Dalton standing on the porch, bundled in a thick jacket, her blonde hair caught beneath a wool cap. Evelyn opened the door. "Mariah, is something wrong?" Mariah hesitated, eyes wide with worry. I didn't know where else to go. I saw your truck in town earlier." Samuel looked shaken when he came by the store. "I thought something must have happened." Evelyn stepped aside to let her in. "It's complicated." Mariah's gaze drifted to the ledger on the hood table. "This about Ashfall?" Evelyn didn't deny it. Instead, she motioned for Mariah to sit. The young woman did, her jaw tightening as she looked at the worn pages. "You said he came from a farm up north," Evelyn began. "Do you know anything about where he was kept before the auction?" Mariah nodded slowly. "Not much. The man who brought him in never talked. He just said the horse had outlived his usefulness, but she swallowed. I remember something strange. When we unloaded him for the intake check, he flinched just being near the trailer's back wall. And his coat, there was dust all over him, black dust, like he'd been rolling in soot. Mariah shivered. It didn't feel right. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Ashfall through the window. The horse had settled more now, the movement of his breathing calm and steady. I found coal dust on him, Evelyn said softly. The kind from the number 9 shaft. Mariah's eyes widened. But that place is shut down, condemned, so they claim. Evelyn closed the ledger gently. But the shaft is open, Mariah. Someone's been down there, recently. And whoever kept Ashfall locked in that tunnel didn't want it discovered. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Mariah let out a shaky breath. What do you think they were doing? I don't know yet, Evelyn answered. But it involved equipment no one documented, people no one identified. They erased their presence from every official record. She paused. And the collapse, it happened right after their unlogged visits. Mariah's hands tightened around her scarf. Evelyn, this sounds dangerous. Yes, Evelyn whispered. It does. The admission hung heavy in the air, stirring a chill that the fire couldn't warm. They sat like that for a while, the older woman and the younger, united by a thread neither had expected to share. Evelyn saw worry in Mariah's eyes, but also something else, resolve, the kind that came from growing up in these mountains, where every family carried the stories of those who worked and died under the earth. What can I do? Mariah finally asked. Evelyn hesitated. She had walked alone for so long that asking for support felt foreign. But Ashfall had brought her this far. The mountain wouldn't give up its secrets easily, and she was tired of facing its shadows without a second voice to steady her. Tomorrow, Evelyn said, I want to go back to the ridge, but not into the mine, just near it. I want to follow the prints again, see if there's a pattern. Someone's been moving horses in and out of there. Mariah nodded. I'll come. I've handled horses all my life, and someone should be with you. Evelyn placed a hand over hers. Thank you. Before Mariah left, she stepped out to see Ashfall. The horse lifted his head, studying her with quiet intelligence. She reached out tentatively, and he pressed his muzzle into her palm. He trusts you, Evelyn said. Mariah smiled faintly. Or he knows he's not the only one who's been scared. After she departed into the dark, Evelyn lingered for a moment on the porch, watching the faint glow of her taillights disappear down the mountain road. Ashfall moved beside the fence, brushing his muzzle against her sleeve. You knew I needed help, she murmured. Didn't you? The horse breathed softly, his eyes reflecting what little moonlight trickled through the clouds. Inside, Evelyn double-checked the locks, extinguished the lamps, and returned to her bedroom with the ledger tucked under her arm. She lay awake long after midnight, the mountains humming with truths she could almost hear. When dawn finally crested the ridge, it came not gently, but with a thin gold assertion, light forcing itself into the cabin like a promise. Evelyn rose, dressed, and stepped outside. Ashfall stood waiting, head turned toward the trail that led back into the forest. She touched his shoulder, steadying her breath. We'll face whatever this is, she whispered, together. And somewhere deep inside the ridge, beyond wood, stone, and human fear, something shifted again. Not the echo of collapse, not the sigh of settling earth. Something alive, something watching, something that didn't want the past rising into daylight. Morning arrived with a bruised sky, muted lavender mixing with streaks of gray, as though the mountains themselves were unsure whether to welcome the sun or warn against it. Evelyn stood in the yard, tightening Ash Fall's lead rope while Mariah secured her backpack, the two women moving with an unspoken urgency. Today wasn't just another search for answers. Today, Evelyn would step into the open, no longer quietly grieving, no longer allowing the past to dictate the future of the valley. The truth had begun to stir, and she felt its weight settling on her shoulders like an old, familiar coat. Ashfall tossed his head slightly, sensing the shift in mood. His reddish mane lifted in the cold breeze, and his ears stood forward, alert. His scars, usually hidden beneath the messy layers of fur, seemed sharper in the morning light, reminders of where he had been, of what he had endured, of what he had witnessed. Mariah approached, adjusting her gloves. "You ready?" Evelyn wasn't, but she nodded anyway, "As I'll ever be." They started down the winding trail that led into town, Ashfall's hooves thudding softly against the frozen ground. With every step, Evelyn felt the ledger tucked in her satchel, its weight more ominous than comforting. Samuel's words from last night echoed in her mind. It's happening in real time. The thought chilled her more than the winter air. As they neared the edge of town, the hum of morning life became clearer. Coffee shops opening, trucks rumbling awake, porch lights blinking to life. People noticed Evelyn immediately. They always did, but today their glances lingered longer than usual. Some tilted their heads, some whispered behind cupped hands, and others simply stared at the sight of her leading Ashfall toward the town square. Mariah leaned close. "They're confused." "No," Evelyn corrected softly. "They're afraid of what this means." When they stepped into the square, conversations quieted. The statue of the old coal foreman towered above them, casting a long shadow across the gathering crowd. Last time Evelyn had stood here, it had been as a grieving mother clutching a folded flag. Now she stood as a woman carrying something more powerful than grief. She carried proof. Mayor Dalton, Mariah's uncle, approached them, adjusting his glasses with a look that was half concern, half irritation. "Evelyn, Mariah, what exactly is going on?" Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "We need a meeting. Everyone needs to hear this." People drew closer, murmuring. Some recognized the ledger tucked under Evelyn's arm. Others recognized Ashfall's injuries. A voice rose from the cluster of townsfolk, Mr. Greeley, whose brother had died in the collapse. "What's she got there? That book. Looks like a mine log." Another woman pressed a hand to her chest. "Lord help us, is this about the accident?" The word accident tightened something inside Evelyn. She stepped onto the low stone platform near the statue. Ashfall followed, standing tall beside her, his breath forming soft clouds that drifted into the cold air. Mariah stood at her other side, her expression steady. Evelyn scanned the faces before her. These were people she had known her whole life, neighbors who brought casseroles after the collapse, children who had once played with her son, miners who had survived shifts that others didn't. Their eyes held history. Their hearts held wounds. She took a breath. "You've all heard stories about the number 9 collapse. You've heard the reports. You've read the headlines. But today, I need you to hear the truth." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Evelyn opened the ledger. The pages trembled in her grip, but her voice did not. These entries were never included in the official investigation. They show unauthorized operations inside the shaft the month before the collapse. They show unexplained deliveries, missing equipment, inspectors who weren't from the county. The mayor stiffened. "Evelyn, this isn't—" "It is," she said sharply, louder this time, "and you will let me finish." The crowd pressed in closer. She held up a brass shift tag. "Yesterday, I found this inside a section of the mine we were told had collapsed completely." A section I accessed because Ashfall, this horse, had been down there. He was held there. Gasps rose. Someone asked, "Held? Held for what?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "But someone has been using that mine. Recently. And someone tried to make sure it stayed. Hidden." Mariah stepped forward. "I saw the dust on Ashfall myself. Black as coal. This wasn't from a pasture or a barn." Evelyn continued, her voice steady but full of emotion. "For 20 years, we believed the collapse was natural. We believed those trapped inside, including my son, died because the earth shifted. But the records here suggest something else. Unauthorized equipment, unauthorized personnel, a hidden agenda." The murmur turned into an uproar. People who had once mocked Evelyn now looked shaken, furious, heartbroken. Mr. Greeley's face crumpled as he stared at the ledger. "My brother. So he didn't die the way they said." "We don't know everything yet," Evelyn said, "but we know enough to realize the truth was never given to us." A truck engine roared at the far end of the square. Heads turned. A black SUV pulled up, sleek and out of place in the old coal town. 2 men stepped out, suits pressed, expressions unreadable. The crowd fell into uneasy silence. One of them approached. "Ms. Hart, we'd like to discuss your claims privately." Evelyn straightened. "No. If you have something to say, you'll say it here, in front of everyone." Whispers spread through the crowd like sparks catching dry brush. The man's jaw tightened. "You are interfering with property under federal review. We advise you to cease your—" "Save it," Evelyn interrupted. "You don't scare me any more." Ashfall stepped forward, hooves scraping against the stone, positioning himself between Evelyn and the men in suits. The crowd surged behind her. For the first time in 20 years, the town didn't shrink under authority. They rose. Mr. Greeley stepped beside Evelyn. "If you've got answers, speak." Another former miner raised a fist. "We deserve to know what happened in that shaft." The men exchanged nervous glances, realizing the crowd was no longer meek, no longer silent. Evelyn lifted the ledger high. "If you won't tell us the truth, we will find it ourselves, and we will not be silenced again." A roar of agreement swept through the square. Ashfall exhaled, long and steady, as though releasing a breath he had held his entire life. Evelyn placed a hand on his neck, feeling the strength beneath his scars. The men retreated toward their SUV, muttering to one another, clearly unsettled by the uprising of an entire community united by loss and awakening truth. As the vehicle sped away, leaving a bitter trail of fumes behind, Evelyn turned to the people of her town. "We start today," she said softly but firmly. "We uncover everything, for our families, for our friends, for the ones who never came home." The crowd stood silent, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of resolve. The mountains, towering in the distance, seemed to lean closer, listening. And somewhere deep within their ancient bones, the echo of the past stirred again, no longer fading, but rising. The storm rolled over the mountains long before the clouds arrived, rumbling low in the earth, pulsing beneath the frost-bitten soil, as if the ridge itself were waking from a long, troubled sleep. Evelyn felt it in her bones as she stood outside her cabin at dawn, Ashfall at her side, his breath curling like pale smoke into the cold air. Today was the day everything would break open. She didn't know how. She didn't know what would follow. But she knew the truth had been set in motion, and nothing, not corporations, not fear, not buried lies, would stop what had already begun. By mid-morning, trucks began creeping up the mountain road toward the No. 9 site. Sheriff Keller's cruiser, several pickups driven by former miners, even the mayor's old SUV. Folks who had stood silently for 20 years now gathered with a determined weight in their steps. Some brought lanterns, some carried notebooks, others brought nothing except the memories they'd avoided confronting. When Evelyn and Mariah approached with Ashfall in tow, conversations quieted into a respectful hush. The exposed entrance to the shaft looked even darker today, as if it sensed scrutiny and recoiled. Evelyn kept a hand near Ashfall's shoulder. He stood steady, though she felt the tension in his muscles. He remembered this place in ways no human could. Sheriff Keller met her with a nod. "We'll proceed carefully. No one goes inside until the structural team arrives." Evelyn appreciated the caution, but it was the ledger under her arm that felt like the key to everything. Pages of hidden history. Proof that someone had manipulated the truth, shaping tragedy into something that looked like fate. Now, with the whole town watching, she opened it once more and began reading entries aloud, names of visitors, unauthorized deliveries, movements recorded in shaky handwriting. People listened. Some cursed under their breath, others wiped their eyes. Mayor Dalton cleared his throat, voice thick. "We'll contact the state and the federal board. Whatever happened here, whatever was concealed, this town deserves answers." Before Evelyn could respond, Ashfall lifted his head sharply. His ears pinned forward, body tightening with sudden alertness. A sound followed, a soft metallic click, faint but unmistakable. The crowd turned. From behind a cluster of rock and brush, a man emerged wearing a charcoal jacket, moving with the slow confidence of someone who believed he belonged wherever he stood. Evelyn recognized him instantly. One of the men from the SUV in town. He lifted his hands halfway, a gesture that was neither friendly nor threatening. "You've made quite a spectacle," he said calmly. "But it would be wise to step away from this site. There are ongoing federal evaluations underway." Sheriff Keller squared his shoulders. "We've found enough evidence to justify a formal investigation. You need to leave this ridge until we understand what's been going on." The man's gaze shifted to Evelyn. "Ms. Hart, you're interfering with a matter that predates you." "Predates me," she repeated softly, "but took my son." A murmur rippled through the crowd. He inhaled slowly. The collapse was tragic, but stirring it up again will only— "You already stirred it," Evelyn cut in, "when you stepped back into that shaft." For the first time, a crack appeared in his expression. She pressed onward, feeling the truth rising in her like a tide. "You kept animals in that mine. You transported equipment through those tunnels. You reopened a condemned site. Why?" "Classified work," he answered too quickly. "Mapping seismic patterns, exploring gas pockets. Nothing to do with your town. Nothing to do with that incident." "That incident?" Evelyn's voice trembled, not with fear, but with clarity. "You didn't just steal the truth. You stole our chance to grieve honestly." Mariah stepped forward, anger bright in her eyes. "And you kept a horse down there. You kept Ashfall. Why?" The man hesitated. He was part of a behavioral study, measuring navigational senses under low-light conditions. Evelyn felt her stomach twist. Behavioral study, a living creature in a collapsing mine, a place where her son had died, and they had used it like a laboratory, cold, detached, careless. "You turned the mine into an experiment," she whispered. "You kept operating in secret and blamed the earth for what you caused." The crowd surged close. Former miners who had lost brothers, fathers, friends. Women who had stood at vigils, waiting for news that never came. Children now grown, who had learned too young how grief shapes a town. Mr. Greeley's voice cracked as he stepped nearer. "My brother, was he—" Was he near your operations?" The man's jaw tightened. "There's no proof of that." "But no denial," Evelyn said. Silence burned through the cold air. And then Ashfall moved. He stepped into the space between Evelyn and the man, not aggressively, but with a measured firmness, as though drawing a boundary no one had asked him to draw, but everyone understood. His presence shifted the air, his breath steady and warm. The man in the charcoal jacket took half a step back. Sheriff Keller motioned to 2 deputies. "Escort him off the ridge, now." As the deputies led him away, he spat over his shoulder. "You're making a mistake. You don't know what you're uncovering." "No," Evelyn murmured. "We finally do." When the SUV disappeared down the road, the ridge seemed to exhale. The mountain grew still again, but not with silence, with anticipation. Evelyn turned to face the crowd. Her voice, when it found her, was soft but sure. "For years this place held our sorrow. Today it gives us back our truth. And from that truth we decide what comes next." Mayor Dalton nodded solemnly. "We'll push for a full inquiry. Court orders, environmental records, everything." People nodded, shoulders lifting as if shedding years of buried weight. Some cried quietly. Others stood tall for the first time in decades. Evelyn lowered her gaze to Ashfall. His eyes, dark and reflective, met hers with a depth she could not name. He had endured darkness, confinement, and fear, and still chosen to lead her to the place where her story had broken, where her son's story had ended, where healing could finally begin. "Thank you," she whispered into his mane. The wind picked up gently, stirring the pines along the ridge. Clouds parted just enough for a single shaft of sunlight to fall across the entrance of the mine, illumination touching the stone that had once stolen so much. Later that afternoon, after officials began taping off the site and people dispersed in small clusters, Evelyn walked Ashfall back toward the cabin. The trail felt lighter beneath her boots. The trees around her no longer loomed. They simply stood witness. At home, she opened the paddock gate and let Ashfall wander freely. The late light set his reddish coat glowing like embers beneath the drifting clouds. This valley had been a place of loss, but now, slowly, it was becoming a place of remembering, honestly, clearly, without fear. Evelyn leaned her arms on the fence and watched Ashfall settle near the tall grass. Peace, fragile but real, pressed against her heart. "You didn't just bring me answers," she said softly. "You brought me back to the world." Ashfall lifted his head, ears turning toward her at the sound of her voice. She smiled, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel fully in decades. And the mountains, ancient and steady, held the moment gently, no longer burying the past, but letting it stand in the open, where truth could breathe and healing could finally take root. The day the town held its breath had ended. And for the first time in 20 years, the air felt clear. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share a simple comment below and let me know what part stayed with you the most. And if you'd like to join me for more gentle, meaningful stories like this, feel free to subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us.